Okay, everyone, you are very welcome to our training session today. We are very excited to have Camille join us. But before we get into the training, we have some exciting updates coming from Key Futures, new programs. So I'm going to pass it over to Daniela to tell you a little bit about that first.
Hello everyone. So just a few quick announcements. In January 2024, Key Futures will be launching a new website, and on that you will find a host of new programming that will be offering for museums, individuals, and there will be many um, options for you. And the climate control program is also accepting applications for 2024. And yeah, you will be able to sign up for memberships that are monthly as well. So if you are an individual, that is something that you can definitely continue on with and sign up for. So we're hoping to see you all again in 2024. And Katrina, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Daniela. I actually still find it crazy that we're coming to the end of 2023. I feel like it's been the quickest year. But yeah, we have exciting updates to come, and there will be a lot more information available soon. And now I'll hand it over to you. You can take us away with it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can everyone see that?
Yeah,
And can you hear me okay? Is my volume okay? Okay,
it's
awesome.
good.
Let me. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this super timely session. I'm Camille Mary Sharp. I'm speaking to you today from Lenape-Hoking, land of the Lenape, also known as New York City, where I work and where I live for most of the year. I teach in museum studies at NYU. I research and write about museums, specifically around topics of activism, politics, climate, and funding. I also come to you as someone who participates in certain forms of activism and who has experienced staging an activist intervention in a museum, which maybe I'll have time to tell you a little bit about. But I'm so grateful that you've all taken time out of your day to come and listen to me talk about climate activism in culture, and hopefully to engage in a bit of a discussion and brainstorming session about this growing and polarizing phenomenon that is climate activism and climate related activism in institutions like museums. So thanks to you for being here. Thanks to Key Culture, specifically Catriona, Daniela, Moira, and Caitlin for inviting me and facilitating this session. And a quick thank you as well to my mentors and colleagues whose work and support have led me to the kinds of ideas that I'll be sharing with you today. So I want to start off by just recognizing how wonderful and important it is for us to just be gathered together to think about this topic. I think it's a topic that, at least in our minds, has reinforced the siloing of different museum communities in their respective interpretations of climate activism and their responses to it, whether that be activist groups, precarious workers, or museum leadership. But that polarization is very much the product of, well, several things, but primarily media coverage that's been quite antagonistic and clickbaity around this topic, as well as the structural disconnect between different classes of workers and management and visitor communities in museums. So whether you're here in your capacity as a public engagement coordinator, as a museum leader, as a conservator, it's definitely already a step in the right direction to just be here, connecting together, and starting conversations that will hopefully be much more long lasting. And so, with that, I also want to say that with the diversity of profiles and institutions represented in this space comes a variety of different perspectives, opinions, and institutional contexts. And so if you disagree with things that I highlight today or things that come out of the brainstorm session, that's probably normal. And I think it's good, actually, because it means that we can learn from each other. So these are the main 4 elements that I want us to take away from today. We'll start with some important historical context to really anchor this current moment of heightened activism in museums within its rich history. I'll then offer us tools to help us develop critical understanding of this moment, whether that be through additional details and context, parallels with other movements and events that we're seeing in museums, and perhaps a little bit of political economic frameworks, which, don't worry, really just asks us to think about who holds material power in a situation or in a broader social relation. Then I'll point to some initial pathways that I see in addressing climate activism from within institutions, pathways that are primarily creative, holistic, and concerned with the bigger picture. So you won't hear me call for increased policing or anything like that. But an important caveat here is that, as we know, every museum is very different and has its own set of dynamics and local communities that they should be accountable to. So there's no one size fits all solution to climate activism, just like for any other aspect of museum practice. And this is where I hope to hear from you in our final section here through a brainstorming session where I'll invite you to share your thoughts around a set of questions in a collaborative brainstorm board, which I believe will allow you to stay anonymous and contribute to the board. So I hope you can feel uninhibited to share your perspective based on your own personal and institutional context. Okay. So the first message that I want us to take away from today is that activism in museums is not a new phenomenon. There is a very rich history of activism and protest in cultural institutions, specifically in the US and in the UK, since the early 20th century. And I'll share a brief timeline with you to highlight some key moments from this history, but also, since we have limited time to get into it all, I will recommend some books on the topic that have really helped inform my understanding and my teaching. But first, I want to flag why it's important to highlight this history and to think about current activism within a historical context. First, it helps us to identify the longevity of various communities resisting museums for different reasons, but which are all actually quite connected. And it helps us to identify the longevity of museums being highly contested sites with often very contradictory histories, ideals, and practices. As museum studies scholar Kirsty Robertson writes, museums are right at the intersection of art, politics, and the economy. And so when we zoom out to look at this longer history of activism and protest, it helps us to, one, take the not so savory media coverage of recent climate protests with a grain of salt, specifically as it tries to create divisions between us, between perhaps the younger generation of activists who are painted as not serving the broader environmental cause, as not respecting art, right? So understanding that this is actually a continuation of resistance. And two, to help us reflect critically on the museum field today, rather than asking, why are activists so intent on protesting us, protesting museums? Asking instead, why is it that year after year, decade after decade, museums remain sites that various communities feel the need to activate through unsanctioned interventions, like the one seen here from just last month, Just Stop Oil, smashing the protective glass of the toilet of Venus at the National Gallery, which we'll talk about as well. And the answer for me here to this question is both positive and negative. It's negative in the sense that it confirms how slow to change, how slow to progress, slow to reform museums have been, whether it's around racism or the climate crisis or the fact that the funding landscape for museums is so dire that it creates this immense pressure to protect these incredibly valuable artworks. But it's also positive in that it means the public still feels a stake in the work that we do. The public still sees this ideal that museums embody, this ideal of public space for dialogue and equity and social good. And that external kind of public vision of museums is really valuable because we can get tunnel vision when we work in museums for a long time. We can take things personally as our professional stakes become entangled. So in a way, being reminded through these bold interventions of what new worlds are possible is productive in helping us collectively as a field manifest the new kinds of cultural spaces that we want to create. So, jumping right into our timeline, this first slide shows some notable instances of protests in museums or on the doorsteps of museums in the 20th century, beginning, of course, with notable suffragette slasher Mary or Mary Richardson, slashing the famous painting, The Toilet of Venus by Diego Velázquez at the National Portrait Gallery in London in 1914. This slashing was part of broader political actions and disruptions, including hunger strikes, to pressure the UK government to give women the right to vote. And in her defense speech, Richardson said, quote, "I care more for justice than I do for art," end quote. So already over 100 years ago, we see a very close parallel to what is happening today. Then in our timeline here, there's a bit of a lull in the following decades, at least from my research on activism in museums until around the 1960s. But who knows, maybe more instances of protest from those quieter decades will one day emerge from the historical record. But so in the 1960s and 70s, we see a period of intense protest and social movements, especially in the US, stemming from the civil rights movement, the American Indian movement, second wave feminism, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And we see all of this political activity converge in museums, especially between 1968 and 1971, in museums in New York City, with artist unions forming, with collectives calling on greater representation and participation in museums from Black, Puerto Rican, and women artists and cultural workers. And we also see rising critiques of museums' financial ties to the US war machine. Notably here in 1974, artist Tony Shafrazi spray paints Picasso's Guernica MoMA, with MoMA having several pro-war folks on its board. And I'll highlight in a couple of slides how I see the anti-war movement and activism very much overlapping with climate activism. But just for the sake of moving through our timeline here and highlighting perhaps a more traditional climate-related protest at a museum, in 1976, 250 people protest Reed Paper sponsorship of the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. Reed Paper was a subsidiary of Dryden Chemical, which was actively dumping mercury in the English Wabigoon River in Northern Ontario, severely impacting the health and environment of First Nations in that area, including people at Grassy Narrows. You can read more about that history, including how legendary Canadian artist Joyce Wieland marched into the gallery to take her work off the wall in protest, in my first reading recommendation, Tear Gas Epiphanies by Kirsty Robertson. I also have a link that I'll share in the chat. Hopefully that will work out. If you're interested in that book, there we go. So around this time, the 60s, 70s, 80s, we also start to see pieces of institutional critique being exhibited in museums. And that is artworks that critique institutional and museological practice. So while this is a different kind of activism, in this case, for example, in 1985, artist Hans Haacke exhibits his piece Metro Mobilton at a private gallery, which is a piece that directly critiques the Met's sponsorship by oil company Mobil. I still think it's very relevant to the climate activism that we've been seeing in museums since the 21st century. And this last example here in this, I'll return to this final one here in a few slides, but essentially in 1988, the Lubicon Cree Nation in so-called Alberta, Canada, organized a really widespread boycott of a Shell-sponsored exhibition at the Glenbow Museum. And Shell had been illegally drilling in the Lubicon's territory at the time. And so I think it's important to return to this example once we wrap up our timeline here, to really tease out how climate activism in museums and Indigenous resistance and decolonial frameworks and reforms are really intertwined. So here are some fun photos to illustrate little elements of this timeline. We have the toilet of Venus, or Rokeby Venus, here after it was slashed in 1914 by Mary Richardson. This is quite a powerful image, if you ask me. Particularly thinking about the political struggle of the suffragettes and feminism, and the more recent intervention of the group Guerrilla Girls in the late 80s that showed how less than 5% of the artists exhibited at the MoMA were women, but that over 85% of the nudes in the museum's artworks were nude women. And here is a photo that's reprinted in Kirsty Robertson's book of those activists at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 1976, making signs to protest an exhibition's sponsorship by the very polluting Reed paper. I'll give you just a sec to look at this cool image. Okay, so moving right along to the second part of my timeline here, taking us into the 21st century with examples of activism that may be a bit more familiar to us than perhaps the previous ones. In 2003, we see the emergence of activism in museums that is specifically against oil sponsorship or oil investments. And this anti-sponsorship stance is what would characterize the next 2 decades of museum activism, especially in Europe and in the US, up until we get to our current moment of soup slinging or soup throwing to bring attention to the climate crisis. So this begins with London Rising Tide, protesting the National Portrait Gallery sponsorship by BP, which would eventually be the catalyst for forming the collective Art Not Oil. We'll see that BP becomes quite the villain within the public psyche around this time, especially after the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, which killed 11 people and millions of living organisms. In 2015, we also see resistance to David Koch, the right-wing billionaire, extractive industry mogul, trustee, and donor to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, which itself had investments in the oil sector. 2018 was a big year for Dutch museums, including the Van Gogh Museum, with activists protesting their sponsorship by Shell. And then for 2015 to the present, it becomes harder to select just a few instances to highlight since this is a period of really intense climate activism in museums where it's happening all the time. So I will close off the examples with the intervention that I was involved in at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, where we staged a counter tour of the museum's Gallery of Minerals, which is heavily sponsored by the mining sector and is basically a celebration of resource extraction with very minimal attention to issues like labor, environment, or colonization. So our counter tour is actually available online with a lot of visual aids, even if you're not able to make it to the museum. So I'll share that in the chat with you now, just in case you're interested. Here we go. And so while I'm also linking things in the chat, let me recommend my last two book recommendations for your personal library or your museum library on the topic of activism in museums. The first is Culture Strike by Laura Reikovic, which I'll link. And the second is Museum Activism, edited by Bob James and Richard Sandel. Let's link those as well. I'm actually doing okay with this multitasking, I think. And last one here. Okay. And here are just a couple of very cool photos of some of these interventions that we just discussed in the timeline. So we have Liberate Tate here at the Tate in 2011, staging the performance Human Cost on the first anniversary of the BP Gulf of Mexico disaster. And then on the right, we have activists from Fossil Free Culture Netherlands, smearing the windows of the Van Gogh Museum that was sponsored by Shell in Amsterdam. And my main point here with these two examples is that anti-oil activism in museums in the 2010s has primarily been in Europe, which is just something to think about. And it's also been primarily sponsorship related. And what's interesting about this in relation to our current moment is that anti-oil sponsorship activism in museums has primarily been a form of art activism, which you can read more about in Paula Serafini's multiple writings on this topic. There's lots, so I'm not going to link a single one. But art activism is essentially when activist collectives, which are usually composed of artists and cultural workers, stage interventions that speak the museum's language. So staging artistic performances that are theatrical or operatic, like the one we see here by the group Libérons le Louvre, which seeks to divest the Louvre from its sponsorship by French oil company Total. Art activism also entails interventions that are museological. So things like counter exhibitions, counter tours that use museological practice, but in a subversive way. So like the Stolen Goods tour in 2018 at the British Museum, or like Beyond Extraction's counter tour of the ROM's Mineral Gallery. And then we see this shift very recently around 2020, where the next generation of activists begins to channel its climate grief and social media savviness into provocative disruptions. So here, reconnecting back to the 1974 intervention on Picasso's Guernica and seeing similar tactics with groups like Last Generation, but most notably Just Stop Oil, who you see here at the National Gallery in October of last year after throwing Heinz tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers and then gluing their hands to the wall. That painting was behind protective glass and was not damaged. These activists asked, quote, "Is art worth more than life, more than food, more than justice?" End quote. And they also clarified, quote, We never ever would have considered doing this if we didn't know that the painting was behind glass, end quote. Very recently, as I showed on a previous slide, just last month, activists from the same collective also smashed the protective glass of the Toilet of Venus. And again, reconnecting us back to the slashing event of that same painting in 1914. The activists just last month, they said, quote, "Politics are failing us. It failed women in 1914 and it's failing us now. New oil and gas will kill millions. If we love art, if we love life, we must stop oil," end quote. In a way, I think it's good that people are feeling emboldened. We need this inspiration. We need protest. We need disruptions. We need to question and critique the status quo, and we need to really shake up institutional authority. But I'll leave you with, or I'll leave this slide with words from artist and writer Michael Wang, who recently wrote, quote, "The sense of endangerment that these actions elicit forces us to reckon with the matrix of values in which the works are suspended and upheld. Climate activists meticulously stage events in ways that limit harm. Environmental activists are, after all, making a plea to preserve the world," end quote. So here I just wanted to highlight a range of responses from institutions to activism in museums. So first we have hashtag Open Your Lobby from 2020, where after some social media campaigning by activists, museums in the US, like the Brooklyn Museum, opened their lobbies to Black Lives Matter protesters. So that meant that protesters were allowed to take a break in the lobby, use the facilities, the water fountain, the washroom, etc. Then we also see in 2022, museums like the Reina Sofia in Madrid increase security, surveillance, and police presence to try to thwart any potential climate activism towards their artworks. And then we have the infamous statement also from last year, where 92 museum directors signed a statement by ICOM Germany stating that they have been, quote, "deeply shaken by the recent trend of climate protest in museums, specifically activist targeting of artworks." And the main point I want to make with this slide is that a variety of institutional responses is possible. We're seeing it right here. Personally, I think policing and surveillance is not the answer. It goes against what we've been trying to improve on in museums. This also tells me, especially the third one, that the priorities of museum leadership are skewed. When directors can have such an emotional response to an object, to artworks getting targeted, but can stay silent, for example, when Palestinian cultural heritage is deliberately targeted. So just a couple of weeks ago, the world's third oldest church was targeted by an Israeli airstrike, which killed over 18 civilians, including children who were sheltering there. We haven't heard much about this in the museum field beyond what I see as a completely inadequate statement from ICOM. In fact, we're actually seeing an opposite reaction, where museums are shutting their doors and perhaps their ears to activists denouncing the very tangible complicity of museums in genocide through their financial partnerships and their trustees. The reason I'm highlighting this example, aside from its urgency, is that climate activism cannot be disconnected from broader calls for decolonization and social economic justice. So, for example, the military is one of the top polluters in the world, the top users of fossil fuels. Also, entire ecosystems have recently been wiped out through carpet bombing. On an even more basic level, there is no climate justice when people are being murdered en masse. I think recent events have really highlighted what Indigenous artists, curators, and scholars have been telling us for a while, which is that decolonization in museums is very much an empty appropriation, co-optation of radical aims, where, for example, we've even seen an Indigenous curator recently get fired for their personal stance against a genocide. And so I think activism in museum, climate activism and climate-related activism, right, because it is all related, also represents a moment of clashing, where people are resisting these institutional statements and frameworks that actually do nothing to change the status quo. And don't get me wrong, this critique goes both ways, right? This critique that climate activism has to be connected to decolonization, where white environmental activists, for example, need to be really mindful not to overlook the racism that underpins mainstream environmentalism and the environmental racism that also underpins neoliberal shifts towards renewable energy. And a really great article that touches on these issues is by TJ Demos, which I will link here. And so I also mentioned earlier that I wanted to return to this key case study from 1988, when the Lubicon Cree Nation in northern Alberta protested and boycotted an exhibition titled The Spirit Sings at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, which was sponsored by Shell. This was actually the first anti-oil sponsorship protest in a museum in history, at least that I've come across. And here we see artist Rebecca Belmore staging a performance in solidarity with the Lubicon outside the Thunder Bay Art Gallery, also in 1988. And you can see that Belmore is draped with the Shell logo, critiquing this idea that Shell is sponsoring the display of Indigenous art and material culture to sort of wash their own image and to help, excuse me, to help dilute the fact that Shell was illegally drilling in Lubicon territory at the time, drastically affecting the health and livelihood of the community there. And so we see how this is very much entangled with Indigenous land rights and sovereignty. I won't say too much more about this because I have written about this topic, and you're welcome to read that article. But just a note that the Lubicon didn't actually get a land claim settled with the government, the federal government, until just a few years ago. And just to show you, if you thought that the conservative news coverage of current climate activism is bad, this was the media response to the Lubicon protest in the 80s. And so these kinds of headlines show us two things, or they show me two things. First, that times do change in the sense that the Canadian museum field has since reflected back on this moment with a lot of regret and a lot of will to change and reform, though not necessarily about sponsorship, but about the collecting and display of Indigenous material culture in museums, which is something that came to the surface through this controversy with Shell as well. And the second thing is that it shows us that also times don't change, because we are seeing very similar antagonistic coverage of recent museum disruptions. And that's because the ruling class will never approve of disruptive protest methods. Why? Because they're disruptive, because they challenge the status quo, because they shake up our cultural norms. And this is where we have this tension, because we desperately are in need of structural change. We need the status quo to be disrupted. But I think the powers that be would rather see us be perhaps offended by such disruptions like those of Just Stop Oil and stay distracted from the larger goal and reality that honestly, disruptive methods are desperately needed. Right? So per the Just Stop Oil activists, women didn't get the right to vote through voting or through words. They got it through deeds, right? So now that the radical politics are out of the way, before we get to our Miro brainstorming board, I did want to highlight a few pathways that I think we can take from within museums to respond to climate activism and, in fact, to activism more broadly. So these are deliberately broad, since every institution is different and will need to shape and adapt measures based on their own contexts and their own mandates. So first, respond to the message rather than to the intervention itself. Focusing on the intervention itself, like the act itself, I think leads to fear, leads to stress, leads to temptation to over-police and to surveil our visitor communities. Another thing about when we respond just to the act, to the intervention itself, and I hope this doesn't sound defeatist and it's not meant to be demotivating in any way, is that as long as museums are still standing, activism in museums is not going to stop. It may take on different forms, but it's not going to stop. So if we focus, for example, on the act of throwing soup at a painting or gluing one's hand to the wall, and we try to find ways to deal with that in isolation, yeah, perhaps you'll be able to thwart activists for a few months, but methods will change and adapt. So I think focusing on methods and interventions is a bit of a waste of energy. But when we focus on the message, we find a point of agreement. Most people in your organization will agree will agree with the message, even leaders and perhaps even board members. So that brings us together and gets us to think about frameworks and objectives that we can all get behind rather than spending time disagreeing about the methods that activists are taking. Because I think that ultimately is a distraction, right? We know that big media is invested in having us argue about semantics, about cultural clashes, about minute details to distract us from actually resisting power structures and working towards positive change. And so how do we avoid those distractions and work towards positive change? Well, that's by finding opportunities for engagement for audiences and workers alike. What I mean by that is, how can you bring your visitors into discussion? How do we get people to get off their screens, debating the latest clickbaity headline about a museum protest, and actually get them to share time, share space, share conversations with us about climate, about activism in art and culture? Right, there's such a rich history, as we've just seen, to be like the topic of a lecture series, of exhibitions, focusing on programming as well, right? So right now we're seeing people all over the world gathering together to make protest signs every weekend. Perhaps your museum can be a space for creative, crafty workshops. I think Caitlin Southwick, founder of Key Culture, had mentioned in a previous talk, having fun workshops, perhaps around what kinds of materials are safe to throw at artworks, to easily remove and to not damage paintings, etc. So here, kind of moving from engaging your visitor communities to engaging the activists themselves, and saying, we see you, we're with you. And what I like about this idea is that now we're moving towards also engaging museum workers, specifically people, for example, in conservation, to help discuss these considerations, to help lead these workshops. I'm personally not in conservation circles at all, and I wonder how much the topic of activism has been brought up in those professional circles. Have there been conferences around this theme? What do conservators have to say? I feel like their voices are really missing from this. And this is also where we can engage staff beyond security staff and public relations folks. I mean, a security and PR focus is just such a neoliberal model of operating a museum anyway. And this is why it's important to keep priorities in focus by highlighting structural issues. So there's decades of literature on how museums have become neoliberal institutions, mirroring corporations, essentially by focusing on growth, marketing, public image, consumerism. How can we keep the focus on the structural issues that are leading to our grievances around climate activism? Does it mean perhaps that we need a stronger institutional position and policy on the climate crisis that we can point to inspire and justify and support our previously mentioned engagement with visitors, with activists, with workers on this topic? Does it mean that we need to take it down a notch with the surveillance, with the policing, with the security, because we know that it makes institutions less welcoming and less inclusive to marginalized visitors and marginalized artists? Does it mean that we need to advocate for more funding so that we have more resources to respond to this topic, so that we can pay our maintenance staff and our conservators more adequate wages so that they feel valued and have more flexibility to engage in holistic discussions around this topic? And so empowering workers leads to these last 2 points here. Don't worry, I'm almost done. I think we should be empowering workers to help convert pressure into change, with workers as intermediaries between activists and leadership, museum leadership, that is. So perhaps there are some of us here who are not activists, who prefer to push for change within our work, within our institutional setting, which is still great, which is still important. And this is where, even if you don't exactly side with climate activists, you can still view them as an important community that's calling for change from outside the museum, and that can help push the needle a little bit when it comes to advocating to the leadership, whether that be about better wages and work conditions, about climate policy, or about ethics. And finally, this last point echoes what I've already mentioned, but I feel like it deserves its own line, and that is to uplift labor power, to promote solidarity with movements, and to improve working conditions for those who are most affected. And just a quick thank you to my colleague Haley for helping me think through this important point. So we've seen, especially recently, how museums silence their own workforce around political issues and political activism, whether that be through fear and self-censorship or actual contract clauses preventing the communication of personal political stances. I don't think that is conducive to helping us move forward on the topics of activism in museum spaces. The less we engage and the more we repress speech, the more of a target museums will become. This is where collective organizing and unionizing is very important. We've seen through anonymous groups like Change the Museum on Instagram how powerful collective organizing can be for museum workers that don't typically hold much power within their institution, where they can sort of come together without compromising their job security. And I'd also love to see workers, especially, like I said, conservators, maintenance and security staff, actively lead and participate in these conversations around climate action in museums, because they're the ones who are most affected, right? They're the first responders, so to speak. And I know we're coming up time, so this is just my closing slide. If folks have want to get in touch, you can get in touch at cmsharp.ca. And I'm just going to pull up the Center for Sustainable Curating here and share that. And then I'll take a look at the board and see how we made out in that way. Okay. Yeah, it's called Using the Resources at Hand, Sustainable Exhibition Design. Shoot me a message if you want to get in touch. And thank you so much again for being here and for participating in this. And if you missed anything, we'll put up just the talk portion of it on YouTube as well. So thank you, everybody.